We're talking today with Mr. Donald Cripps of Battle Creek, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Mr. Cripps, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? For instance, where were you born?
I was born in Battle Creek, Michigan, and when I was 9 years old, we moved to a little town of Athens. That was during the Depression days, and so it was a little cheaper to live.
Mm-hmm.
And my father worked at the what we call the Federal Center now. Then it was the Battle Creek Sanitarium. My whole family worked at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and I worked different jobs throughout my lifetime too. I met a lot of famous people, Mrs. Roosevelt and lots of people.
Mm-hmm.
Had good contacts, and then when I always wanted to be a doctor, but there was no money to be had. I didn't know what I was going to do, and so when I graduated from, I was an athlete in school. I played football, got letters in football and basketball and track. And
then when did you graduate from high school?
1939
Mm-hmm.
in Athens, Michigan. So then I went back to Battle Creek, and I worked with the sanitarium there. And different jobs. I worked at the main desk, and I bellhop, and I worked on the sanitarium farms. I was in charge of the orchard one year. I had a number of different jobs, and but I knew that was what I was going to. I even stayed on the 11 because they were going to bankruptcy. The sanitarium was going broke,
Mm-hmm.
and I lived on the 1102 at the tallest building there for 1 year, and then I had my friend that I went to school with in Athens. We were always good friends, and he'd be darned if he didn't have a job at the sanitarium also. And now the historian wants to interview me now because I can tell him things about the sanitarium that they don't even have a record. I've been to places they don't even know it's there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to somebody soon. I can't think of his name anyway. And my friend said, well, we're going to be drafted. Well, I couldn't go on to college, and so my dad knew a retired professor at the University of Michigan, but he also stayed at the sanitarium. He said, if you like, I'll start him on his career now until he gets the money or whatever he's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I started there. So that year, I just studied for the University of Michigan. I had two subjects and still worked.
Mm-hmm.
And then when my friend said, well, we might as well, the National Guard, we'll be drafted. And so I joined with him, and knowing that I was going to be drafted. And I was only in the Guard probably for a month and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And we trained in Kalamazoo on the streets.
Mm-hmm. But when you were training in Kalamazoo, did you have weapons or anything like that?
I'll tell you, it was right back to World War II. I had the leggings that you wind up leggings, you know.
So the World War I uniforms.
World War I, 03 rifles, which I'd never seen an 03 rifle until we got down in Louisiana,
Mm-hmm.
and we had campaign hats, the old World War II, and the helmet, everything was World War I equipment, and we marched up and down the streets and things like that, and the fellow who was in there at that time, the captain was Captain Walker. I guess he was a World War
One veteran.
One.
Yeah.
And you had a first lieutenant that was his name. It was Fitzgerald. He was in World War I, and then we had a second lieutenant. That was the only officers we had, and this second lieutenant was named Bush, and he was first sergeant, and he went up through the ranks, went to the officer school,
Mm-hmm.
and with the guards. And then most of these young guys that came in are around 20 years old
Mm-hmm.
in that area because there was no work anyway.
Right.
And because they trained in 1 year you go to McCoy, Wisconsin, and the next year they'd be at Grayling, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And to them it was like a big vacation anyway. And we only got $21 per month at that time, and so then they were federalized, and on that train that took us, we were going to Camp Beauregard in Louisiana. Now,
All right. So you're federalized on October the 15th, 1940.
Yeah.
That's right?
Yes.
Okay. And they load you on the train to Camp Beauregard.
That whole group is the history. of the men that Dennis is taking care of now is the group that went on that train. There was no draftees yet.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay, about how many men were in your company initially?
there was supposed to be 200, but there
Right.
probably was 170 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't full strength.
Right.
And then we went to Camp Beauregard, which was used in World War I as a training camp, and nothing. All it is a monument,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing. We had no place to go. We was going to go there, and they were going to build us a camp. Camp Livingston was going to be built.
Mm-hmm.
It had already been started, and so we trained. We trained in a tent there, and a real rugged time, and even the cook had to cook stuff on a homemade stove that they had used, and we marched out each day with a band and trained, and that was like our boot camp as near
Mhm.
as I could.
Right.
I guess I could describe it.
That was
And
the idea.
And then we weren't. I don't know if it was there about 6 months, I think. I don't know for sure the exact time. Because Camp Livingston, which is near Alexandria, Louisiana, that's the nearest town.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we moved in, because that was a luxury compared with what we had used to be in. And
Well, now what did the training itself consist of? What were you doing?
because they had well, they didn't know about the Japanese
Mm-hmm.
at first, because I was on Pearl Harbor Day. I was on leave in New Orleans,
Mm-hmm.
and the loudspeaker came through and said, "All the soldiers get back to camp right now."
Right.
Because that was Pearl Harbor, and then they decided they was going to train us for jungle warfare. They never had anybody trained for jungle warfare, and
Well, were they giving you any jungle training in Louisiana, or did that wait until Australia?
no, we didn't. Actually, we had very little jungle training any place.
Mm-hmm.
We went into action before it that we should have gone. Anyway, they give us something there. We had no equipment, no machine guns. Everything was assimilated.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one time we marched all over Louisiana in the swamps.
Right.
That's like where we was going to fight.
Mm-hmm.
And we had just the old 3 rifles. Eventually, they gradually give us some of the equipment that they got as now.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were down there, we finally got the Durand rifle,
Mm-hmm.
and which we carried. We used that going right into the war zone, and so and then the conditions around there were still pretty much. Everybody, the blacks were still. So they had drinking fountains for blacks.
Mm-hmm.
They were in the back of the buses, and it was a new world opened up, and that was more or less the training there.
Well, tell me just a little bit more about what kinds of jobs, what things that physically, what did you have to do? Were you marching? Were you shooting? Were you?
No. Well, we had some target practice, and
Mm-hmm.
not very much, but each day we marched out behind a band out to probably 3 or 4 miles out in the country in Camp Livingston and Camp Beauregard.
Mm-hmm.
Both did the same thing. March behind the band. We had your flag or your unit on. In fact, we still got that flag.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the museum at Kalamazoo
Right.
now. They probably told you about
Mm-hmm.
that. And then after our General Harding was our general at
Right.
that time, and then all of a sudden they decided we was going to go to Europe,
Mm-hmm.
but it was pretty rough training because we're not used to anything like that,
Mm-hmm.
and so they went to Camp Deving. We went to Camp Devings in Massachusetts, and we trained there for a while. We had, of course, we had regular barracks.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't used to that sort of thing, and I guess MacArthur wanted Harding's division, and so they shipped us clear across the United States. We didn't know he was going to go to Australia,
Mm-hmm.
but we went to San Francisco.
Right. Now, what was that train ride like?
It was Well, in fact, it was kind of fun. Most of us had never done anything like that, on the train. And we got to San Francisco, and they put us in the Cow Palace. That's where they kept animal shows and stuff like that. It was rather new at that time. We all stayed in the stalls of and then I happened to have one particular assignment. I was a corporal by that time, and so a corporal was in charge of a squad at that time.
Right.
Buck sergeant was still he was the platoon sergeant. Those ranks went up over the years from staff sergeant to tech sergeant.
Right.
And they wanted me. And a lot of them on AWOL. So I was on an assignment to go look at all the dives around, see if we could find our soldiers. Actually, we didn't even care if we found them or not. We was having so much fun.
Right.
So then was there about a week or so, I think, about a week. And then we got on the lower line. Now, the lower line was a passenger boat between the Hawaiian Islands, a luxury passenger boat between the Hawaiian Islands and the United States. And they had filled in the decks, about 4 deck, filled them in with bunks four high.
Right.
There was about approximately 5,000 troops put on that. He still had the civilian crew on that boat. And
how many bunks were piled on top of each other?
I think it was either 3 or 4. And then at the end of the thing, they made a temporary toilets, which was they were putrid anyway. And I was sick. It took 3 weeks to get to Australia, and I think I was seasick the whole time. And you had to line up. So many people were on that boat. I had to line up 2 hours before you eat in order to get your hand out of your food.
Right.
And I'd get up there, and I was too sick to eat it. I just took some fruit and went back in my bunk again. So that was quite an experience for us. And then we arrived in Port Adelaide in South Australia. And the reason we went to Port Adelaide, we didn't know at that time that we were headed for New Guinea eventually, but was going to train for jungle warfare, and actually what we was going to do is train to protect the Australians,
right?
Because they figured the Japanese were going to come in and take Australia, and because all the Australian troops are over in the Middle East,
right?
And so we went to Port Adelaide, and we parked us right near a winery, which was a bad place to put a bunch of soldiers. And it was, I think it was about October at that time. Now that's semi-tropical. They have orange trees and tropical trees, but I can remember the pails we had. We had regular tents and the old fold-up cots that you put up yourself. And the Australians, being that they were a big sheep country, their number one meat was mutton.
Right.
And but they thought, well, we'll give the Americans the mutton, and we'll have the beef. But we could smell that mutton 10 miles away, and we couldn't eat it. So we got sneaking out and going to the farms and bringing food home and cooking it ourselves. And eventually they let us have beef.
Right.
So we trained there for a few weeks while they were building a camp in Brisbane, Australia, to continue our training. And this, we had to go cross country by train because the Japanese submarines are all along there, and
right.
Most of their equipment was gone by boat around. If you're familiar with Australia,
right.
The shape of clear around Passport, Moresby, and Sydney, and up to Brisbane. And on that trip, the first man of our division was killed, and I just had his name, but now I'll tell you. Anyway, He was from Battle Creek, Michigan. Just happened to be. Or I had the name, and it was all I could tell you. But his name, but maybe I'll think of it.
And was he killed in an accident, or?
No, no, they was shot at from the subs,
Okay.
and so they named that training place. But it was an unusual trip to take because each state in Australia has a different railroad gauge, and you have to get out at the end of each state, and go on to another train. But it was an experience right there for alone. And then we got up to Brisbane, and we trained there for a short, it wasn't going to be too long of a time, and then they decided that they was going to ship it. While I was in Adelaide, I happened to go to a school down there, and I met friends that we've kept in touch with for 60 years, and we kept contact constantly all the time, and trying to think. Oh, what I went to school for was we thought we was going to have to live on the land, and we had to go out in the center of Australia, which is a desert,
right?
And from the Aborigines, we learned like you could eat the grubs and stuff, like where the water was on certain plants, because we thought we was going to have to defend on the land. And that's a bit of background. And then when we were ready to go, they got Liberty ships. They were right new, and those little Liberty ships. And we went on the Liberty ships.
Okay. Now, before they send you over to New Guinea, did you get any kind of jungle training, or what they call jungle training?
We had some, but it was nothing like what we actually. We never had proper equipment in the first place, and what they had to do for camouflage outfits, they didn't have camouflage outfits, so they took our uniforms and sprayed them green. Of course, if you by spraying them, you couldn't get any air through them.
Right.
And so when it was actually in jungle warfare, every time we get to a stream, we take those off and try to scrub the paint off over it. And then we landed under very dangerous time in Port Moresby, and so there we stayed there for I don't know, several weeks. It wasn't that long.
Now, what sort of place was Port Moresby at the time?
Port Moresby is the only place in New Guinea that it looks just like an Australian town. And of course, Australians are people that it's one of their possessions.
Right.
And it would be like any little Australian town. But we were outside of the town, and we never got into the town much in our camp. And as it happened to be, we had an epidemic of diarrhea, terrible. Couldn't eat, and our cooks, nobody could eat the food. And so in Port Moresby, you're at the foot of the Owen Stanley Mountains, which are 12 to 13,000 feet high. And they figured that, the Australians figured that the Japanese could never get over that mountain, but they were starting to trickle over. Those that got over weren't worth much anyway. And so they decided we were bombed by Japanese plane. They had air superiority most of the time, and so every night they'd try to show us from our foxhole a big movie. They'd show it to us, but that's as far as we could go anyway with the diarrhea, because that was going on. And but every time they come over, they'd turn the lights off and get back and dive in your hole again. And so that's. And then they was getting ready. They decided that part of them was going to go over the mountains. And before I forget it, the first, our colonel of the 126th Infantry, full colonel, I did know his name, but I can't think of it right now. But he was making a survey over New Guinea before we actually went into the action or did anything, and he was shot down. He got killed. I was a full colonel, and then part of us, our particular company, we got separated from most of the fighting in New Guinea. They probably told you that. I was from a different side than the rest of them.
Right.
The other guys you interviewed, they were in different, and then they decided, because the whole thing was getting Buna. It was an airstrip, and MacArthur said, "You take that Buna, no matter who is killed or what." He never set foot in New Guinea at that time. Before this thing, they said, "You take him, no matter what." And most of those men in that division, the 32nd Division, Wisconsin and Michigan, were killed or wounded or diseased. There was a lot of disease.
Right.
And I had malaria 6 times, and most of the men that you interviewed, they all had malaria too.
Well, what sort of effects does malaria have on you, or did it?
Yeah, it's a high fever, and you just can't move. And in fact, a lot of men died over there because there was no one to take you out. And eventually they didn't have any medicine. Well, all they had was quinine at that time. But there was an Atibrine that the Germans had invented that would have helped us a lot, but we didn't have it because being Germans being our enemy, we didn't have the Atibrine at that time, and he just more or less just laid down and stayed there until you could move again, because there was no way of getting you out. And after a while, your fever keeps going down, and then eventually we got. While I was there, they got the Atibrine through somehow, or they made it their own formula or what, I don't know, because it helped, but it wasn't any cure.
Right.
There wasn't any cure.
Right.
I used to have to stand my men up and make sure they put the pill in their mouth because they wanted to go home. And everybody was yellow looking, all the time. It affects your body.
Right. The Atibrine also could make you yellow.
Atibrine does that.
Okay, let's sort of back up a little bit now. Originally, the division is basically mostly in place at Port Moresby, and and part of your regiment is assigned to walk over the mountains. Now, the part that you were with, how did you get over to Buna?
Then they decided there was a little strip right up there in the northern shore there. I think it was near Pongoni, and that they thought they could get some airplane in that little. Wasn't a strip at all. It was just open field.
Right.
And so I think one of the planes crashed going in there, and so part of us got in that plane, and I was one of them. And from then on, it was a jungle walking. You haven't met any enemy yet. It's along the coast and with the coconut palms and all that was along that coast, and I don't know how the only food we got was dropped by airplane, and because the Japanese had air superiority, and we may get the food and we may not. Most of it was sea rations. Sometimes we got the Australians corned beef and hardtack. Sometimes we got their food, and sometimes we've gone as high as 3 days, never got any food. You couldn't build a fire or do anything because if you did, the Japanese would be after you. The only equipment you had a shelter hat. It rained every night, and just about in terrible temperatures. Mosquitoes. We wore a mosquito net over there. And then the Duran rifle, they had in each squad there'd be, we had
one Browning automatic.
Browning automatic, and then they finally got one in each squad got this little hand machine gun. It would have a drum of either 50 or 20.
Right.
But we would use the 50s because they rattled. And so that's we haven't seen any enemy yet.
You know, were you seeing any natives in that area?
No, natives at all. Well, there's some natives, yes, because a lot of natives took some of our equipment, but you couldn't trust them. They might just go right in the woods and dump you, and the only food, the only pay they got was some of our sea rations. That's how we paid them, and we were told not to go into any villages because those people would starve to death because they don't know enough to keep food, and they had a little garden and stuff, and then they didn't want you to be near their women, which nobody would want to be anyway, but they more or less all the animals. Of course, there's no only animals you got. You got the alligators, but is a lot of poison snakes. But we didn't. With all the troops there, I didn't hardly see a snake there.
Right.
Some of them did, some didn't. But we also had that problem in Louisiana maneuvers. There was a coral snake. We lost several people down there, and then we was going along the coast, and towards where we was going to make contact with them. And then the first thing I seen you just still didn't think he was in a war. And then all of a sudden, there's right along that coast there was sort of a backwater in a river. The Australians had little boats that was trying to get up closer to the front, and then all of a sudden we seen hundreds of bloated bodies of Australians. That was the first realization that we were in a war.
Right.
And that was of course that shook us all.
Now, what happened after you came on that scene?
Then we kept right on going. There was nothing, we couldn't get boats in there either. We couldn't do nothing about it. That's all we could do was get to we meet. Along with that, there was some Australians too, you know. And the Australians, and until we kept on going like that up the coast, and had many one, and finally you couldn't dig in holes because it was right on the 6 inches down was water, and the only water you had to drink was brackish water that you took in it with a pill in it to purify it, but you never quenched your thirst none of the time. Well, sometimes you quenched your thirst a bit with the coconut palms because you open up the coconuts and drink it, but if you did, then you got diarrhea.
Could you do anything to catch the rainwater?
No, you're not any place long enough to catch it anymore. No, with these little streams you go into, and like I said, we tore our clothes all off and scrubbed them in the sand. That's the only way you could keep them clean. And we didn't have any heavy equipment, so it's from 60 millimeter mortars and the machine guns. And
so you basically had what you could carry.
What you could carry, and we did. They said later they had tanks, but we had not any big guns, and mostly mortars and machine guns.
Right.
And then we got up there where they figured the enemy was going to have contact with the enemy the next day. They said it was going to be it. So they said, take your men and 100 yards up the road. We'll assemble up there. And I got up there, and I didn't have any men there. They all took off the other way. We went back and reorganized and jabbed them a bit, and then went back and started over again. And even before we went up there, our platoon, our supply sergeant, he went berserk, and he got into a hole and was shooting everybody. And he finally got killed. That's the beginning of the action. And from then on, it was we had a jungle path. There's no communications. There's only a runner or something. You didn't have, and radios or nothing like that in there. And then we had different incidents, and it's kind of boring in a way. But you didn't see the soldiers. And at night, two guys would sleep together, and so he could. One of you stayed awake while he stayed awake, and until you hear the Japanese, they make noise at night and say English things to get out. And we found some of our soldiers. We didn't take any. The Australians wouldn't take any prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
We took a few prisoners, and we didn't want to. If we did, well, the Australians would kill them before they got back to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
And we found some of our men that was taken prisoners, and they'd be bayoneted up against a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to think. All this was log, grass, and every time an airplane, even when our airplanes came over, they didn't know where we were either.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we had to. It was a scary thought.
Okay. And do you remember the first time you actually encountered the Japanese or were fired on by them?
Yeah, when we got up to the line, we were constantly being fired at,
Mm-hmm.
in mortars, but you don't. The jungle is just it's hard to see people.
Right.
And the Japanese had been there enough time ahead of it that they were in pillboxes,
Mm-hmm.
and they were with our equipment we had, it was almost impossible against the pillbox.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been on a lot of patrols, sent my men on patrols, and around the pillboxes would be wire fence,
Mm-hmm.
with cans on it so they could hear you coming
Right.
along. But it was impossible to do anything against the pillbox with the equipment we had. And the Australians, they would tell them that you got to take that pillbox, and Australians, they would try to take the pillbox, and then every guy would get killed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Now, did you have Australian soldiers serving right alongside you where you were?
no, they're not. They're just close by.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't not side by side. They were right. You could just a few feet from us.
Okay, so they were sort of the next section of the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that's the way we fought to clear up the place till we got to near Buna. And we actually when I was on the outskirts of Buna, and when I took cigarettes to my men, and a sniper got me with a 25 caliber bullet. That's what they had,
Mm-hmm.
and they were exploding bullets, which was supposed to be outlawed by the Geneva Convention,
Mm-hmm.
but Japanese don't go by anything like that, and they exploded in me and in my heart and my lung, and then, but I never was out,
Mm-hmm.
and so then they had to get natives. There was no Americans, not enough Americans there to haul you out,
Mm-hmm.
and so they had natives, and they wouldn't use any equipment we had. They had to make something out of poles.
Right. Well, did your own men get you back off the front line a little ways first?
Well, there's no front line really. That's another thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no front line. They could be out behind you, beside you.
Mm-hmm.
You never know where they were. And there's a lot of them got. I got cigarettes to my men because by that time I didn't really care if I got wounded or not. 'Cause it's not like in Vietnam. You're going to be there for a year.
Mm-hmm.
Hell, you didn't know if he's going to be here for 10 years or not.
Right.
You never knew the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was up there, right on that, close to the Buna, all the big General Eichelberger, they came up there, and 2 or 3 other generals, right in their bright chino clothes,
Mm-hmm.
stood out like a thumb, and as soon as they ducked back, we really got peppered.
Mm-hmm.
And they were supposed to have brought us a Christmas dinner, but if they did, I never got it. I got my doubts if they did.
Well, you got hit on December 22nd, right?
December 26th.
Okay.
I know that's the one date I did not forget.
Mm-hmm.
In 1942. And then.
So you've got the natives who managed to sort of take you back, I guess. Did you go to an aid station at that point? Or?
Well, yeah, they had to take me back to. It was a little strip on the coast down there. They had an aid station, and they got some little planes in there.
Mm-hmm.
and all they do is give you first aid stuff.
Right.
And a little planes in there, and they took you out one at a time and flew you to Port Moresby. When I went to Port Moresby, they had a big tent hospital there, and that's where they all eventually, until they could get you in back to Australia. Well, I was shot up so bad, my folks got the telegram, seriously wounded in action, and they didn't think I was going to make it. They had to operate on me and take these pieces of shrapnel out of my heart and lung, and without any painkiller. And then I was too sick too bad to fly back. Some of them could fly back to Australia, but I was too sick to fly. And so then they had what they call the hospital ship called the Wanganilla, and mostly it was meant for Australians to take them back to New Guinea, and I'd be darned if they had room for, I think, a couple of Americans, I guess, and they got on that boat, and so then we went back to Cairns, and the hospital was full. We went back to Townsville, the hospitals are full, right down the coast, and into Brisbane, the hospitals are full. They got to Sydney, and they let only a couple of guys off there, and I was one of them. And then they was going to Melbourne.
Right.
But once you got you out, there wasn't any hospitals built either. So they set us clear up in the Katoomba Mountains, in a resort where each was like a little motel, rooms separately.
Right.
And I was in one of those rooms. And I was there for quite some time. The only ones I see was the doctors, nurses, and Red Cross people. I didn't see anybody else up there.
And how well did they take care of you there?
It was taken care of well, but you never see anybody, nothing to do, and nothing, because I couldn't move around, and I was going to be there until they was building a new hospital in Australia, in Sydney, and after the American style, you've seen all their hospitals; they look alike. And they finally got that built, and then they were sitting down there, and then I went from there to I don't know how many months I was there, and then I went to Prince Alfred Hospital. Was one of the main hospitals in Sydney. It was right downtown, because I'd keep on getting malaria, and it takes about 6 weeks to treat you each time you get malaria. And downtown, I thought I was going to go back home, and they said, well, they needed help over there, and said, do you want to go back? Well, actually, I did, and I said, well, if I don't have to go back up there and play again, I would just soon stay there. And so then they sent me out to, so they decided I was going to, in that same hospital is where my son was born too, but it's going to send me out to a place where you recover, and it's called Warwick Farm. And that's out in the outskirts of Sydney. Actually, it was a horse race track, built tent city there, and so we were back there to get retreated. And
now, at this point, could you walk or get around at all?
I could get around then, but I was limited to do, couldn't do too much. I didn't know what they was going to do with me, and then they finally they interviewed, and they got me a job in the Sydney, in the MacArthur's headquarters. The Grace Building was the tallest building in Sydney. That's only 11 floors high. Right. Because they didn't believe the tall buildings would be in the earthquake zone and be dangerous. And so I was put in charge of because I had some experiences like that when I worked at the sanitarium, and they put me in charge as the chief clerk. They call it chief clerk. I had about 30 people working for me, and civilians, some Army.
Now, what rank were you at that point?
I was a staff sergeant, and then they made me tech sergeant. But actually, you look at the records, I was the platoon sergeant, because the officers were killed, and the platoon sergeant was killed, and several officers killed, and they were going to give me a battlefield commission, but they only got shot up on it. And actually our captain, I might say, probably they never said much about it, his name was Captain Frierson. He took over from the Bush originally. Bush probably, he stayed over there, but he became a major, but this Frierson was a coward, and he had to go back and be tried, and all they did to him was make him a first lieutenant. Kept him in Hawaii, so I don't know if he did better or worse. Anyway.
So now you've been assigned to MacArthur's headquarters. About when was that?
Well, I can't tell you the exact date. Some of the stuff is slipped out of me.
Was it still in 43, or were you in 44?
Yeah, it must have been, 43, yeah. No, I was in the hospital for quite some time. And then, of course, the people that worked there, none of them liked MacArthur. His little kid would be in a hotel across the road to see him playing out there. A Philippine woman looking after him. And they were all the people that were in the office were all people that had been wounded, and their captain was too. And then they decided they was going to move back to Brisbane. So we went back to Brisbane. But before I went there, I had to leave a week's off, and I went to right in the middle of Sydney in a hotel there, and they had what they called a Trocadero, which was a dance hall. It had 2 orchestras and American soldiers, and a revolving stage, and the Australian girls was to meet us there and dance with us, and get acquainted. And the very first night I met my wife there. They weren't supposed to have anything to do with the outside. You leave you when you at the door. I went every night that week. I went there, and continued to go to visit her house while I stayed at this Warwick farm. And then we decided to get married. And so no one had gotten married in those days. They'd allowed the Americans to get married.
So how did you manage it?
Then I had to go see the commanding general of Sydney, which is General Riley, a brigadier general. My money had never caught up with me since I've been wounded. And he interviewed us, said, "Oh, I'll have the Red Cross interview. You got any money?" I said, "Well, I got a 20-pound note that I kept through the war, and I still haven't been paid." "Well, I'll tell you, he took money out of his pocket and gave it to me." And I was one of the first ones that had to go through a lot of red tape. Eventually, there was probably 30,000 Americans married Australians. Eventually, and maybe I won't be in line with these. My wife couldn't get when I went to. Oh, wait a minute! I'll go back to where I was left off again. We went back to Brisbane again. Then we got married. My wife came up to Brisbane too, and we stayed there for about 6 months. Went back to Sydney again, and with MacArthur's headquarters, and we stayed there for a while. And my wife had a baby, and my son was born there. And then they went back to Brisbane again, but she couldn't go up there this time. And I was only there a short time. And then MacArthur's headquarters was moving to Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea.
Right.
And so we went up there because it's a different situation when you're in MacArthur's headquarters. You live like a king. And that was all right up there. But the point systems came out, and I had, of course, one of the top points in that whole area. I've been over there long enough with all the conditions.
Right. And
they said, "Well, you could go home if you want." They offered me a warrant officer's job again. I said, "No, I want to go home." And they said, "Well, you can be in MacArthur's headquarters. You can either fly home or go on the boat." I said, I don't want to go on the boat. And I was sick for 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had to island hop to Los Negros and Bayak and places like that
Mm-hmm.
till I could get a plane, stay there 2 or 3 days, and finally got back to the United States and back to Chicago to be discharged. And I went in there to be discharged. He said, no, you're essential. You go home on a month's leave.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I got home a month, they told me to come back because they're going to discharge me.
Mm-hmm.
But that, you know, disabled.
Now, at that point, was your wife able to come with you, or did you have to
No,
leave her in Australia?
I go on to get, my wife was not able, the war wasn't over yet,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and then she had to wait a year. And incident, the weird part about the thing is that she came back on the Lower Line, the same boat that we went over.
Mm-hmm.
It was 500 wives and about 300 babies. It was
Wow.
a bride ship, called a bride ship.
Mm-hmm.
And they had another experience that she, because that's when they had that big storm in the ocean, it was a famous one.
Mm-hmm.
And they went in Hawaii. In Hawaii, it was laid right, the towns were flat
Mm-hmm.
when that storm.
Right. Now, while you were stationed at MacArthur's headquarters, I mean, what kind of work were you doing there?
It was the Adjutant General's Publications Division. We were the ones that had them printed, all your AR, your Army Regulation books and manuals,
Mm-hmm.
and assembled them and shipped them out to the different units,
Mm-hmm.
to each one of them, to their headquarters units, which was an interesting job. And I had to, I was a supervisor of I was a top non-commissioned officer.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular place was right in Brisbane, the last place that I was at,
Mm-hmm.
before we went to Hollandia. And have you know, you've never been to Australia anyway, but it's right there, the big town hall there. It's
Mm-hmm.
still there, the town hall, but they had a little separate building right beside it. The Adjutant General's Publications Division was, and it was an interesting job, and we had to make all the corrections in all the Army manuals and
Mm-hmm.
everything else, and make sure that all these different units got throughout the whole Southwest Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to go. MacArthur had while he was up at Hollandia, he had a cabin, a house built up there just where his wife could go in
Mm-hmm.
there. And then we were all ready to go to Manila. And when I had a chance to get out.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you get to see much of MacArthur himself, or were you far enough away?
No, just in and out. No, I didn't. I see him in and out all the time, and I seen his little kid playing in a
Mm-hmm.
hotel room across there. But he wasn't too popular amongst the men that worked there. Even the other generals.
Well, as far as you could tell, why was that?
It's the way he was a show-off type of
Mhm.
man. Like it when we went to New Guinea, and he said, "I don't care if every man gets killed. You stay there until you take Buna." He never went up there once. He went to a lot of the places, but he never went there. And then he relieved this Harding.
Mm-hmm.
Things weren't because they weren't getting things done fast enough,
Mm-hmm.
and he put in Eichelberger after that, and MacArthur. You know, I think of a lot of these names, people.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of incidents on the road going up there. And I say one time when that all that food was dropped by air, and sometimes you go 2 or 3 days and then no food because you got to keep right on going to the next stop. And then one time, everybody had moved out, but part of our company, and they dropped a battalion's worth of food on it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we can't. All we did was stuff ourselves and put it in. And they had chocolate bars,
Mm-hmm.
and they never perfected chocolate then that wouldn't melt.
Right.
So we stuffed our pockets full of it and melted and got insects. That was just, it was a weird incident like that. You could we ate some grass, you know, but you couldn't cook anything because we had mortars right on top of you. And we seen soldiers, the Japanese. They wouldn't be taken prisoners. They'd run out into the ocean and kill themselves with their bayonets or blow grenades. They wouldn't be taken.
Now, in the period when you were actually in that Buna sector where the Japanese were, was your unit ever able to sort of move forward at all, or make what you could call progress?
Yeah, they made progress, but very slow. I mean, you might take 100 yards or something like that. And the main thing was the borders. I sent one patrol out for my platoon I'll never forget that one. It was at nighttime, and then here they came back. Well, a few of them did come back. I went on a few of those myself, because you can't make men go if you can't do it but yourself. And one of the guys of the patrol came back, had no face at all. And I met the same man. All he had was holes in his face and his mouth. Back in Port Moresby, I happened to meet him again, but he died. But we had a lot of, not just malaria, but the dengue fever, the black water fever, and all those different jungle rot and all that stuff. Most of the division was killed.
Well, they weren't killed.
No,
they were. But
no,
90% of them were either dead or unfit for duty after Buna.
That's right.
Yeah,
they weren't all killed. But I don't know.
But for an awful lot of them, Buna was the war, even if they survived.
Well, it didn't seem like it was worth it for what. But every little step that you had going towards Japan, because there was island hopping from then on, and a lot of this was different units that were all along the coast. But you're in your own little shelter, and you only had a half a company. And your captain, he'd be right in the middle of all these men all around him, because there was no front line.
Right.
No food, no conditions. It was horrible thoughts. Then you start seeing your men get killed one after another.
In the longer run, they did learn some things from it. MacArthur didn't do quite that same kind of thing again.
No.
And they had better equipment and better supplies and more medicine.
Yes.
But you guys were the guinea
pigs.
We were
there before we should have been there.
Right.
And the equipment we had, the BARs would rust. Hard to keep your equipment. The fact that in every squad you had 103 rifle from World War I, because we could launch grenades with it.
Right.
And so we had one in every squad. And then whoever had that machine gun, the submachine gun, usually were killed right off the bat because they hated them. And in fact, finally I got one too, but I took it for my men because nobody wanted to carry it.
Yeah. Was that a Thompson submachine gun?
Yeah. That was with a 20 drum. We had 50 drums, 50 shells, but they rattled.
Yeah. Those were the gangster movie ones, right?
Yeah, like that.
Drums,
yeah. But they were troublesome too. They were always work. You got equipment. You just didn't have the equipment to take care of stuff like that. And there's no supplies, only what was carried up by natives.
Right.
And no contact. You did have radios and stuff. And eventually they had a few tanks in there, but we never seen a tank. He probably shows you in the records they were, but I never seen a tank there at all.
Well, most of that stuff comes in later.
Yeah, and the Japanese had those 37 millimeters, and we didn't get them until later. We didn't have anything big, but we couldn't fight against these pillboxes because the mortars wouldn't touch them, and the machine guns wouldn't touch them.
You would have to get up very close with grenades and get lucky, right?
I had I didn't want to have to. You slept at night with your buddy, and you kept waking all night.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we had several men who was killed. They killed each other because they thought it was a Jap.
Mm-hmm.
Wake up with, oh, it's too late.
Now, did you manage to catch the Japanese trying to sneak into your position?
No. We slept. Their dead ones are all around, rotten and smelly,
Mm-hmm.
all around us because we couldn't get up.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't dig down to make a slit trench because
Right.
there's water.
Right. Oh.
But there's those kind of conditions, so it was just horrible thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I see a lot of our men get killed.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, if we kind of move here, kind of back out the other end, you kind of, when you finally get back to the States and you've been discharged and so forth, now what did you do at that point?
And then I went because I didn't know what I was going to. I could have because then I had a son and a wife,
Mm-hmm.
and I did the year that I had trained in the college wasn't enough. I had to get a
Mhm.
job right off the bat, and so, but at that time, then I had to go around and check out different places. In fact, I wanted to I had enough cash to buy a new car,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't sell you a new car if you didn't have an old one to turn it in.
Mm-hmm.
Like a Ford, I was going to get a Ford. Of course, at that time, they were only about $700 for a new
Mhm.
Ford,
Right.
but they wouldn't sell it to you. So I had to borrow my dad's car until later on I got another car. But so being interviewed, I got to the Sinclair Refining Company, and I heard of a job there, and it was a dress-up job in the office,
Mm-hmm.
and the man that had the job before hadn't got out of the army yet, but he let them be known that he didn't want to come back there again,
Mm-hmm.
and so I got that job, and I got. The boss there was a real eager beaver guy. He had me belong to every organization
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And then I'd be darned if the guy didn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he wanted his job back.
Right.
According to the government, I had to give it up.
Mm-hmm.
So then I went to work for the Kellogg Company. And they wanted me in the office, but there wasn't any vacancies yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked 6 months at the plant until I got in the office. And I ended up in the research, because research in Kellogg's, which was interesting. And from then on, I worked there for 34 years
Mm-hmm.
in different capacities, and mostly in the engineering offices and planning section.
Mm-hmm.
Because the experience that I had in the MacArthur's headquarters, a lot of that helped me.
Mm-hmm.
And I just stayed there. I had 4 children. Belonged to all the different organizations,
Mm-hmm.
active in the church and active with I've been a DAV, American Legion. I was in them all.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so now all of my children are growing up, and my son was a full colonel. My son-in-law was a full colonel. They were in Vietnam, people, and one grandkid to West Point.
Mm-hmm.
She went back to Iraq, had to go to Iraq twice as a captain, and she met her husband to be was a major. And 2 weeks ago on a holiday, we had a big wedding in Pennsylvania at the War College,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a big outfit, 300 people there. We had the cross swords fight, you know how the ceremony they have
Mhm.
for all that, and they all. And my son keeps up with. He probably knows as much about the 32nd Division as I do, because he's an ardent reader and history, and he was the deputy commander in Fort Carson, the last job he had, and he's still dealing with the Army they sent him overseas, and they sent him to Washington every now and then. They want his opinion because he was on airplanes and disposing of equipment, what they should do, technical knowledge that he has.
Right.
And it's well known around. He knows all the generals. He should have been a general. He had a brigade command for one term, but because the Army had cut back, colonels had to do a brigadier's job.
Right.
That's how close he got to it.
Okay. Now, to look back on the whole thing now, how do you think that your time in the service wound up affecting you? I mean, you mentioned the experience you got in MacArthur's headquarters. What else do you think you kind of carried with you out of all of that?
Well, there's one thing. The group that our original group, we're back to 7 men now, and I think we had about 170 men. They're all gone now, and it's been a comradeship. I think what I find people have their college friends, their high school friends, and people you work with, but I think people that you fight with and you protect each other is a different feeling. You have a different kind of a comradeship, and that's what I found. These people are lifelong friends, and they're not like the rest of them. I can't compare them with the high school people or people you worked with, or the church people, or whoever else. So in general, as I look back on it now, it was a good experience.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me today. That finishes the tape at just the right time.